Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so pleased you've joined me for today's show. Today, we're exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for the province of Ontario. In all of my location-specific episodes, I have included lots of hyperlinks to the local area, in this case, the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act. So if you are wanting more information, make sure you check out the hyperlinks that are in the description of this show. Even if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, all the hyperlinks are there. And same thing with YouTube. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, I am going to screen share, which I'll do here in a second. But here's how this works. Each of my location-specific podcasts are set up in the exact same way, answering 4 questions. 1, what are the basics of the Tenancy Act, in this case, the Ontario Residential Tenancy Act? 2, what are some of the nuances that I've noticed or what's different and stands out? 3, some guidance on abandoned items left behind by a tenant or in the province of Ontario. And 4, where to get help in your local area in the province of Ontario. Now, I must tell you, there are many more things that you must learn than what I'm going to tell you today. This is not everything. This will just get you started and give you some guidance, but there may be other things for your regional district, your city, whatever it might be regarding your rental. You need to do more digging yourself, and you won't know unless you dig more than what I'm going to tell you. So this episode is not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, but this episode will get you started. Okay, like to give a plug for today's sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing, especially with Michael and I, check out alohajv.com, alohajulietVictor.com. That's Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. All right, let's get into it. Let me screen share, and we will talk about the Ontario Residential Tenancy Act. Screen share options. Oh, wait a minute. Screen share, which is that one. Here we go. Sharing right now. Okay. So in all of the locations you're going to see, there is the location, the tenancy laws are an actual law. And so there is always going to be one thing that is super duper legalese. Guess what? Because it is legal. And this is the version for Ontario Residential Tenancies Act 2006 SO 2006 C17. And it's going to go on and on. I'm not going to go through this. And one of the blessings in doing tenancy and housing items is that there is usually, yes, there's this legalese part that is the law, but then somebody somewhere has created info sheets or a guide or a workbook or something that will make this more manageable. And you're welcome to read the legal part. There's no problem with that. That is at the end of the day, that is what's the governing document. But I can tell you that it's kind of hard to read. It's very long, and yeah, this one is super long. So I'm going to switch to the next one that is, here it is, the brochure, a guide to the Residential Tenancies Act. And now this, if you're wondering where this is, again, on YouTube, you're going to see the screen share. Tribunals Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board has created this guide, and this guide is way easier to digest on what is involved. It's about 6 or 7 pages, and it explains a little bit more about the act itself. So I'm going to go through some of this, and then we're going to jump into some of the other items like abandoned goods, and we're going to talk about some of the nuances that Ontario has, including their incredible pre-made forms. If you're into Ontario, if you're about to get into Ontario as a landlord, Ontario has some of the best, most comprehensive pre-made forms in North America. It's pretty spectacular, actually, I must say. Okay, information about the guide. Landlord Tenant Board resolves disputes between the tenants and landlords. Similar to a court, it's not the court. For those of you who are listening who might be from British Columbia, it's very, very similar to British Columbia's residential tenancy branch, Landlord Tenant Board. It is very similar. Either a landlord or a tenant can apply to the Landlord Tenant Board. Disputes can be worked out through either mediation or adjudication. Typically, the court does not get involved unless there is a ruling of some kind that the writ needs to be taken care of. So, let's see. Yeah, in mediation, a landlord-tenant board mediator helps the landlord-tenant reach an agreement. In an adjudication, a hearing is held, and after the hearing, one of the board members makes a decision based on the evidence that is presented and then issues an order, and the order is then final. So that's difficult in housing issues, but that's the way it is. But the landlord-tenant board also provides landlords and tenants with information about rights and responsibilities that they have under the act. You're going to see there is about 90% of what we're going to go through today is the same through almost every other location, but there's a little bit of nuances in everything, and Ontario is no different. So let's get into some of this. So tenancy agreements. You've got to use a standard lease form that Ontario has, which is great. If and when a lease agreement is signed, just like British Columbia, the landlord must give a copy of the written lease to the tenant within 21 days after the tenant signs it. This is actually a requirement. It's not a requirement everywhere, but it is here. And then lease should contain any items consistent. Let's see, the lease should not contain items inconsistent with the act. Okay, well, if you're using their pre-made forms, chances are you're just going to fill it out and it's going to be exactly what's supposed to be there, which is great. There's also a brochure that the landlord tenant board has called Information for New Tenants. Landlords should use it for this purpose. In fact, I will open this up so you can take a look at it. But this is basically going to be a tenancy 101 for yeah, here's the law. This is way shorter than what we're doing. So this is what the tenant is responsible for. This is what you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to change the locks, but the landlord has a right to collect a rent deposit, has a right to increase the rent. Landlord is responsible to keep the property in a state of good repair and provide you a copy of your tenancy agreement. Your landlord is not allowed to shut off your utilities, take your personal property, lock you out. And you can't, in Ontario, this is interesting, the landlord cannot insist that you pay by post-dated check or automatic deposit. You can't, as a tenant, you cannot be evicted for doing that, or for the landlord for insisting that and then a tenant refusing it. But let's go back into this. If we're back into the tenancy agreements, this is again the Guide of Residential Tenancy Act. Going down here, rent for a new tenant. In most cases, they're saying when a tenancy is, okay, hang on a second. There's an announcement that is just, I'm on a cruise ship recording this and the captain is up yakking. So just a second. Okay, almost done. Okay, we're back into it. Okay. So when we're talking about basic tenancy law in Ontario, there, of course, we're talking about renting. When a new tenancy is entered into, a landlord and tenant decide how much the rent will be for the rental unit and which services are included. For example, parking, cable, heating, electricity, could include lawn maintenance, could include snow removal, but in most cases, the rent cannot be increased until at least 12 months after the tenant moves in. And then rent deposit. So it's called a rent deposit in Ontario. Elsewhere, it's usually called a security deposit. And the tenant, let's see, the tenant pays rent by the month. The deposit cannot be more than 1 month's rent. Post-dated checks, I mentioned this already. When a landlord and a new tenant agree to enter in a rental agreement, they discuss how the rent will be paid. But the landlord cannot demand that the landlord cannot require the tenant pay by either post-dated check or automatic payments. So we do this as well, where we offer it if our tenants want to pay by either post-dated check, or they want to pay by cash, then they can walk into the bank and they can put it right into our account. But we do not require it. Rent receipt is a requirement. Landlord cannot charge a fee for giving a receipt. And then rent increase. This is very interesting. Rent increase is always a hot topic. In most cases, the rent can be increased if at least 12 months have passed since the first time that the tenant moved in, or since the last tenant increase. And then you must give a proper notice, which if they're doing landlord must give at least 90 days notice in writing of any rent increase. And you typically, there's rent calculators. You want to actually include the rent calculators and make sure you are not missing your 90 days notice. If you miss it, that is basically, it's null and void. You have to basically start over again. So you want to make sure that you are adhering to this. So rent increase guideline is set each year by the Ontario government, and it's based on consumer price index. This is very similar to British Columbia. Ontario will tell you how much you are allowed to increase rents every year, which is why it's really important to use the rent calculators on the Ontario website. So let's see. Landlord can apply to increase to a higher rent amount if all the costs of taxes and charges have gone up significantly. They've done major repair or renovations called capital expenditures on the property, or operating costs for security services performed by people who are not employees of the landlord. Basically, they're hiring out a security service, and the cost has gone up. So rent increases for capital expenditures and security services cannot go more than 3% above the guideline each year. So you must do some homework on this. This is really important, that if you've got questions about how do you actually do rent increases, pick up the phone and call. Also jump on, I know there's videos on Ontario. There's also Facebook groups on some of this, but it's very important that you educate yourself, not just by reading this, but there's lots of people who want to make sure you get this right. You don't want to do this wrong. Also, they talk about rent reduction. They talk about when costs go back down. I've never seen a rent reduction, by the way, but I'm sure it will happen, especially when it says landlord is required to reduce the rent if a capital expenditure is fully paid for. Like, for example, if a boiler goes out and you've got to increase rent just to pay for that boiler, once it's paid for, it's got to be stopped. So you still have to give proper notice of a rent reduction, but I've never seen that. About maintenance and repairs, landlord's responsibilities, tenants' responsibilities, and vital services. I've seen this shown up a couple times where it's a required services or essential services. So it's very simple. Landlord cannot shut off or interfere with the supply of any of the following vital services to a tenant's rental unit, including heat from September 1 to June 15th, electricity, fuel such as natural gas or oil. Of course, that goes to the heating, and hot or cold water. It just says hot or cold water. It doesn't say hot or cold running water. You'll see that in other location specific episodes, that you'll see running water. So there is another brochure called Maintenance and Repairs. I am not going to go into that one, but you can see right there, if you're watching on YouTube, that there is a hyperlink there. About entering the rental unit, entering without notice, and then how to give proper notice. And these are reasonable hours. You'll see it's usually 8 to 8 or 9 to 9. In Ontario, it's 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Yeah. And then you've got to have at least 24 hours notice. It's got to make sense. There's got to be a reason. You can't just go in. About ending a tenancy, renewing a lease. If a tenant wants to leave, then they've got to give the tenant, it's got to give a certain amount of notice. So if they pay rent on a monthly basis, they've got to give at least 60 days notice, and the termination date must be the end of a monthly rental period. That makes sense. So difference between assigning and subletting. Assigning is a person takes over a new place, like fully in place, like the assignment is the entire lease gets transferred to someone else. A sublet means they're just subbing out part of the rental and part of the time. But the landlord-tenant relationship does not change. And so That's the difference. And it's interesting because most of the time a signing and subletting can happen between a tenant and a landlord, but you've got to work it out, right? You can't just do it. And you know, a landlord can't say no to a reasonable sublet, but you've got to be mindful of doing that. So let's see, there are other special tenancies. You can like if you were working there, you're going to school, a tenant who is a superintendent, or a tenant who lives in subsidized public nonprofit housing, things like that. There are special tenancies, so you also want to make sure that you're understanding how this goes. If you as the landlord want to end the tenancy, you have to follow the reasons for the act. And if you want to end tenancy because the tenant is misbehaving, meaning they're not paying, they're consistently paying late, you must not be tolerating late payments, by the way. There's all kinds of episodes about you get what you tolerate. Please do not tolerate that. If the tenant is causing safety issues, a disturbing quiet enjoyment of other tenants or the landlord, or there's too many people, there is plenty of reasons for tenants' conduct for a landlord to evict them. But other reasons for eviction, the tenant wants their rental unit for their own use. Tenant's going to sell the property, and the purchaser wants all the property of the owner the tenant. The landlord has agreed to sell the property, and the purchaser basically wants it vacant for their own use or immediate family member or a caregiver. Or landlord plans major repairs and renovations that require a building permit and vacant possession, which we've had to do in British Columbia. And there's others that are in there. So some of these are the reasons that a landlord would want the unit empty is because of the tenant. And some of the reasons are not because of the tenant, or other locations call it no cause. There's no cause. The tenant didn't do anything wrong. So you really need to understand what you're doing as far as the Ontario Act. If you are Ontario Residential Landlord Tenancy Act, if you have any questions about this, you need to call the Tribunal's Ontario Landlord Tenant Board. But let's jump into these forms. These forms are really incredible. So you'll see I've shifted the screen share over to the list of forms. And so they call the forms different letters here. N is for notice of rent increase. So you've got the actual form here and you've got the instructions. So you've got two PDFs here. Notice of rent increase, partially exempt, notice of increase, changes for cares. Like there's a bunch of different ones in here. Notice to end tenancy early for non-payment of rent. Let's just go into this one. So this is notice for termination for landlords. And let's just go in here, open file. So this is a pre-made form. It's a checklist. Notice to end. Have you waited until the day after your rent was due to give this notice? You can check. So, and it'll say your tenant has until midnight on the day rent is due to pay your rent. Make sure you wait until that. Did you fill in the correct termination date? Right? Did you name each tenant? Did you sign and date the notice? So this is all the second part of this is to the tenant name from the landlord, address of the rental. I'm giving you this because I believe you owe me this in rent. I can apply to the board and have you evicted. This is called termination date. This is the due date that this is required, and it says exactly how to do it. So this is, you just fill this out. I mean, this is pretty incredible that it walks you through here, right? So, and then there's further instructions, right? I'm not going to open the instructions, but there's instructions in the PDF. And then I would imagine that the N4 instructions are in there as well. So this is notice of rent increase, notice of termination for landlords. And there's all kinds of forms in here, but it doesn't end. Then you've got L forms, application forms. And this is if you wanted to start a dispute for some reason or an application. Just tons and tons. Here's an accommodation request. Here's an affidavit. Payment agreement, request for hearing. This is where you can also submit for a dispute. Information from your landlord about utility costs. Forms for tenants, notice to end, tenants notice to end the tenancy, agreement to end the tenancy. Now make sure, again, all of this stuff needs to be in writing. Whatever you're doing, it's in writing. And if you don't know which form, call them. You'll notice the application for the tenants all start with T: tenant application for rebate, application about tenant's right, rent reduction. There's a bunch of different ones. Application for a sublet, certificate of service. If you're going to serve your tenant something, this is what you use. So this is even more robust than British Columbia. The Ontario pre-made forms, whoever is doing the pre-made forms in Ontario is doing just an incredible job. So just want you to understand. And by the way, this is how you do if there is a issue with your dispute. If you're going to file a dispute, it just says specifically on here, forms for landlords, forms for tenant. Go to the online tribunals Ontario portal. It will explain exactly how to do it. Forms, there's filing. This is exactly how to file these items. So the forms are the first part, filing, and then the fees. If there are filing fees, how to pay them, what to do, what form you can pay them in, how to do it, filing for eviction. And then it explains the whole thing, which is pretty incredible. Okay, let's do the last bit about abandonment of a rental unit. This is all abandonment of personal property. When the unit may be considered abandoned, how do you know it's abandoned? And so it talks about that. Evidence of abandonment. If there is rent due, maybe they didn't pay rent. You can talk to the neighbors. So it talks all about application on what to do. Abandonment. Oh, this was not personal property stuff though. Okay, hang on a second. Because let's see. The tenant, abandonment of a rental unit. Oh, here we go. Okay, so obviously you've got a file in here. I'm not screen sharing this one because I don't want to search for it and pull it up. But tribunals, so the landlord tenant board, personal property, basically what you've got to do is you've got to follow their process. Of course, there is a, let me see if I can find it because I really want to show you. I'm just typing abandonment in the Tribunals Ontario search field. Let's see what comes up. Abandonment. Laws, rules, and decision. Let's see what comes up here. Tenants' rights. I'm just looking at the very end. Decisions. That's right. Abandonment of a rental unit. I think this is the same guideline I have before. Yes. Okay, so it explains further. So yeah. Okay, this is part of the private property part. I just went too fast. Okay, so landlords should make reasonable efforts to contact the tenant and determine if they've left the unit. For example, by writing to the tenant or calling them at different times of the day. Landlord should give the tenant a reason to reply to the letter and keep notes of the dates and times that they telephoned. Failure of the tenant to respond to the letters and the phone calls should be consistent with abandonment of the unit and not with a tenant who's on vacation or out of town on business, of course. So if the unit has been abandoned, the landlord may dispose of any tenant's property found in the unit, provided that one of the following conditions is met. The landlord applied to the board and obtained an order terminating tenancy based on the abandonment of the unit, or the landlord gave notice to the tenant and to the board stating that the landlord intends to dispose of the property if the tenant does not claim the property within 30 days of notice being given. If either of these conditions has been met, the landlord may immediately dispose of anything unsafe, unhygienic, and after 30 days following the issuance of the order or giving the notice may dispose of any other tenant belongings. If the tenant does claim the belongings within 30 days, they must pay the landlord any arrears, rent, and reasonable costs of moving, storing, and securing the property. So if the landlord sells the property, the tenant has 6 months from the date of the order and from the date of the landlord gave the notice of their intent to dispose of the property to claim the proceeds of the sale. Anyway, there is a whole process here. I do have it on here. I do have the hyperlink in the description of the podcast. So if this happens to you, you want to make sure you follow the landlord tenant board rules on abandoned property. It's very important that you do this right. If you do this wrong, it can cost you a lot of money and it's a lot of heartache and it can be really, really stressful. So make sure that you are really adhering to this. So let's talk about more about this. Where do you get help? If you need help in the province of Ontario, where do you get it? Well, one of the options you can do is you can dial 211. I typed in Ontario Tenancy Help and up popped dial 211, which is the rent and housing assistance programs. You can also go to the website 211ontario.ca. Ontario.ca can also help find out some information about housing, but you can also contact the Landlord Tenant Board directly. If you're in Ontario, you can physically go to a Service Ontario center if you're near one. But if you're not, you can speak to someone by calling 1-888-332-3234. And Tribunals Ontario does not email, but there are tons of online items at tribunalsontario.ca/LTB/contact. In fact, I'll go up here and see if I can do that, show you what it is. Move my little guy here. Sitemap. So I'm on the tribunals, ontario.ca, and there is a contact, Landlord and Tenant Board contact. And so it talks all about how this will work, mail, or all the different ways that you can see. This is actually how I got the phone number. Evidence for hearing. So they talk on all this general evidence, but there's tons of places that should give you at least a start on where to go. But please make sure if you've got any issues, any concerns, talk to your local regional district, your city, whatever applies to you in Ontario. But you can start by contacting Landlord Tenant Board or by dialing 211. Somebody somewhere will help guide you, get you started. So just to sum up today's episode, each of my location-specific podcasts is set up the exact same way. What are the basics of tenancy laws in that area? What are the nuances of that location? What are the different things that stand out? And some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant, where to get help in that local province. And it's the same episode. Same layout of each episode. There's one other thing I wanted to mention to you. Oh, applications based on animals. There's two other nuances I wanted to mention to you before we get out of this episode. If you've got an animal, whether it's a pet or it's a service animal, in Ontario, they talk about the tenant of the animal must adhere to a certain behavior. This is really interesting because I haven't seen this anywhere else. So it says the past behavior of an animal that's of that species has substantially interfered with the reasonable enjoyment of a residential complex for all usual purposes by the landlord or other tenants. Subject to the presence of an animal of that species has caused landlord or other tenant to suffer serious allergic reaction. So if they've got allergies or there's a danger, or it says no, danger is the third one. The presence of an animal of that species or breed is inherently dangerous to safety of the landlord or other tenants. So the first one is past behavior interferes with reasonable enjoyment. The second one is if there's an allergic reaction, and third is if it's a danger. You've got to take that into control. And where you can learn more about that is you can talk to your insurance agent, whoever has the insurance for that property. Talk to them and say, are there any limitations on animals and specific breeds? They may say yes, but you need to know that. So that's really interesting. Also, we had talked about in the event there's a death of a tenant and reasonable access. It says specifically in the Ontario Residential Tenancy Act, if the death of a tenant dies in a rental unit and there are no other tenants in the rental unit, the tenancy shall be deemed to be terminated 30 days after the death of the tenant. Reasonable access, and then landlord may dispose of the property, which we just talked about, abandonment. So I just wanted to mention those two things, which are kind of different about Ontario, other than the spectacular pre-made forms. So let's just sum back up. We talked about the basics. We talked about some of the nuances. We talked about abandoned items and where to get help in your local province. And just one more thing, I want to make sure you realize this episode is not all inclusive. You must further research in your specific area, but today's episode will get you started. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you are either new to real estate or you are wanting to be in real estate. you might be a seasoned landlord in the province of Ontario, but things you can do to help yourself are read the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act, or you can check out a local meetup group in your city, regional district, or province. And if you want to jump on social media, you can find I'm sure there's an Ontario Landlord Facebook group or some kind of version of that. I'm in several of those groups, and so you might see me along there if you do say hi. But jump on social media or just Google a meetup, Ontario Landlord, something like that. There are in-person meetings all over the place. You just need to find where the local folks are asking questions just like you are. If you learned something from today's show, could you pretty please give me a review on whatever platform you've listened to this podcast on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, or maybe you listen to this at mylifeasalandlord.com. It doesn't matter, but your input really does help. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about the province of Ontario. I am recording this episode on board the cruise ship Carnival Splendor, floating right off the side of New Zealand. Real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode, which is live right now in the library, episode 125, all about Washington State.